The First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee was founded in 1842, 12 years after the Federal Indian Removal Act passed by Congress in 1830 was enacted with the express purpose to forcibly remove indigenous people from all lands east of the Mississippi. So our congregation was founded roughly a decade after federal policy of forced removal drove Indian people from Milwaukee to west of the Mississippi. A brief history of our congregation titled "The Rooster on the Roof" was published for our 125th anniversary in 1967. The history booklet states, at the founding of our congregation in 1842, Wisconsin was still a territory and Milwaukee a settlement of fewer than 3,000 inhabitants. On the first page of the history booklet, we read, in a long letter dated June 9th, 1842, to the Reverend Charles Briggs, Secretary of the Unitarian Society in Boston, 3 of our early trustees earnestly solicited the aid of our Eastern friends to acquire a minister and become firmly established. $600 was promised toward the minister's salary. Not long afterward came the Reverend William Cushing from Massachusetts to become the first minister of the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. On the second page of the history booklet is a remarkably revealing story about the relationship between the white settlers of our church and the Indian people of this area. Here's a story that is told about our congregation's first minister's family. An incident related by the Reverend Cushing's youngest daughter tells how her mother, having heard many tales of Indian scalping in the West, one day was terrified to see an Indian at the door of their home on Lower Prospect Avenue. Hastily, she grabbed her baby daughter and fled to safety at a neighbor's house. Later, she returned to find the Indian was friendly but hungry and bent only on asking for something to eat. To most Easterners, Wisconsin was still a raw country. And sometime later, early records are missing, Mr. Cushing returned to Massachusetts with his family. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What was at play in the Cushing's decision to leave Milwaukee after approximately 1 year? Mrs. Cushing's fear of Indians may have been a major factor. In any case, now that we know this piece of our church history, we are compelled to notice, as our senior minister, Reverend Jennifer, said to me recently, our congregation was founded in a space and time of fear of Native Americans. I have served this beloved congregation for 12 years and had never seen our 125th anniversary booklet, The Rooster on the Roof, and so had never heard this story about our first minister's family. This seemingly small story opened up some big questions for me. I got the book American Indians in Milwaukee to learn more. The Oneida authors, Antonio Doxteter and Renee Zachar, write, The history of any city in America is steeped in Indian history, and Milwaukee is no exception. The pattern of urban settlement is similar as well. Indian autonomy, Indian removal, an invitation to come back and recreate a city's imagined romantic past, and finally, Indian resettlement under new conditions. Around the time of the American Revolution, Milwaukee was a gathering place, a cluster of the 5 relatively autonomous villages of Potawatomi, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk, mixed with significant minorities of Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Sauk. Canadian-French fur trader Jacques Vaux staked a claim in Milwaukee, marrying a daughter of an Indian leader and establishing a robust trading post by 1795. Vaux's daughter Josette married his clerk Solomon Juno in 1820, and by 1825 they took over her father's post and helped build the character and foundation of Milwaukee. Solomon Juno, as you may know, was a fur trader turned real estate developer who developed the downtown and east side of Milwaukee, where our current church building happens to be located. In 1837, Juno started the newspaper, the Milwaukee Sentinel. He was the first postmaster of Milwaukee, and in 1846 was the first mayor of Milwaukee. In 1848, he registered his wife and 12 children as members of the Menominee Nation. So just 3 years after our congregation's first minister, Reverend Cushing, and his family left Milwaukee to return to Massachusetts, Solomon Juno, married to a Menominee woman, served as mayor of Milwaukee. William H. Metcalf, a wealthy shoe manufacturer who was a trustee of our church and a major benefactor, commissioned and financed, with his business partner, Charles Bradley, a statue of Solomon Juno that currently stands in Juno Park, not far from our church building. When I first saw the statue, I thought it was interesting that Solomon is depicted wearing moccasins and leggings. But I didn't find out why until I read about his relationship to the Menominee tribe and his marriage to Josette, a biracial French and Menominee woman who is widely considered the founding mother of Milwaukee. Two of my favorite books when I was a child were Caddy Woodlawn and the Laura Ingalls Wilder series. Both stories began in Wisconsin. Both were fiction based on a particular family's real life experience. Both had a young pioneer girl as the main character who came of age during the painful history of Indian removal, forced relocation, and their aftermath. Both stories contain the damaging trope of the savage Indian, the hungry Indian, and white settlers grappling with their fear. Sometimes the characters saw the humanity of the other and forged connections across difference. Sometimes they were able to break through their prejudices and the strong current of fate to arrive at some understanding. The key to these breakthroughs was the power of questioning why things were as they were. For example, why was the Indian hungry? What happened to them to cause that hunger? However, the pioneer spirit and thereby settler colonialism were the most celebrated themes in these novels. What was in the soil of my life where these stories took root? I believe, since I drank in these stories soon after I was weaned, that I learned to accept settler triumph as a given. As a child, through these stories, I mourned the passing away of the Indians and their way of life, but did not question why or how this happened, nor interrogate my assumptions. As a child, I don't recall asking what Indian communities were like in the present. In the present. In fact, I didn't learn that the entire land we live on was stolen from Indian people until my 10th grade social studies class. My knowledge of Indian history and contemporary culture did not expand until I became an adult and read stories written by Indian people. This is amazing to me. What was in the soil of the land where I was raised that made my ignorance possible and so disturbingly normal? I grew up in a small town in central Minnesota. There were no families of color living in my town throughout my 18 years there. I did not interact with students of color until high school, when foreign exchange students were hosted by AFS and Rotary. As I came of age, I knew this homogenous experience was odd and not representative of wider society. But until just a couple months ago, I never questioned why. Why was my small town all white? How did it get that way? Were Indian communities removed from that land during the Federal Relocation Act? What about the railroad that thundered through the little downtown? Did Chinese immigrants build it? Did the Underground Railroad and Sojourner Truth also come through there? Can families in my small town trace their lineage to soldiers who fought in the Union Army during the Civil War? What is the history of migrant farm laborers in central Minnesota? Were there populations of people of color who lived there as seasonal workers on the farms? And what are the racial demographics of my hometown these days, many decades after I graduated high school? Well, one thing I know, my tiny town is no longer tiny, but has grown from 2,252 people to 25,000. It is now considered an outer ring suburb of Minneapolis. High school students in my hometown recently made the news when they joined a statewide walkout on April 19th in protest of racial injustice. Minnesota Public Radio News and Sahan Journal reported, when some of those same students tried to discuss racism in class, it sparked a social media backlash against their educator. A social studies teacher invited the district equity specialist to visit her 9th grade classes on April 15th to address student questions about Minnesota protests to police violence. The teacher described that day's lesson as a constructive discussion that helped students make sense of current events. But a video of the discussion, secretly recorded by a student, went viral on Facebook. Parents were outraged and called for the teacher to be fired, while in contrast, a 6th grader circulated a petition to help him keep his job, which amassed more than 15,000 signatures. At one point during the thoughtful, nuanced conversation in the classroom, a student asked the school's equity specialist, "Why do some people loot after police kill a person?" The educator's response was easily misinterpreted out of context on social media. Why did news of this schoolroom discussion become so incendiary? Social media, for one, demographics for another. The news article reports in the last 10 years, the percentage of students of color in the district has nearly doubled to 15%, but the town is still more than 90% white. The conflict in the school district appears to mark a transition in a growing town that's becoming more diverse. Schools look to equity staff to help students adapt to that change. As demographics shift, more students speak up against racism in their schools, and vocal groups of parents organize for racial equity. But there's no guarantee that constructive conversations about race and diversity will follow. A 15-year-old freshman in that social studies class said, "Our school has always been known for racial slurs, any type of slurs, really. It's not uncommon to hear the racist N-word or the homophobic F slur 5 times a day in school." A district alum from 2011, one of the only students of color at that time, frequently heard racial slurs. He said, "If we keep thinking time will change things, it will not. Racism won't go away on its own." When our worship associate Susie Seidelman and I were preparing today's service, we talked about the moral dilemma of living on stolen land in an economy that was built on the stolen lives and labor of African people taken into chattel slavery. The toxic nature of our national history is deeply rooted and pervasive. Susie said, "It's like the entire United States of America is a national Superfund site." We wondered together, is it even possible to be rooted in soil that is not contaminated with the toxicity of our country's history? How do we reckon with that history and transform the soil to grow healthy, justice-filled lives? One of the pieces of our congregation's history that we tell is the inspiring story of one of our early ministers, the Reverend Nahor Augustus Staples. He served our congregation from 1856 to 1861, during the period when our society was resuscitated after lying dormant for 7 years, when the members fell on hard times and the congregation's building was foreclosed. The Reverend N.A. Staples was an abolitionist. The years spent in Milwaukee, his biography states, were the most dreadful of that dreadful time, when the South was violent and aggressive, the North vacillating and timid, when judicial blindness of a most dangerous sort afflicted the Chief Justice, and James Buchanan was the tool of a pro-slavery cabinet. On November 24th, 1859, Reverend Staples preached a Thanksgiving sermon entitled "The Irrepressible Conflict," which vigorously articulated his opposition to slavery. It was printed soon afterwards and widely distributed across the country, giving great offense to those who supported slavery, including a significant number from within the congregation. Staples' sermon startled the community like a fire bell ringing in the night, as the Milwaukee Sentinel described it some years later. Our 125th anniversary booklet states of this event, "A few pro-slavery members of the congregation were so offended that they withdrew from the society. But generally, the sentiments expressed in the sermon were acclaimed by church members and the community. When the war broke out, Mr. Staples was offered the chaplainship of the 6th Regiment of Wisconsin Volunteers and left with them in July 1861. At the front, he contracted a disease which was to prove fatal. I want to make sure you heard this detail in that story from our congregation's history. Some of our members withdrew their membership because they disagreed with their minister's opposition to slavery. Let that sink in for a moment. When I told this story from First Church History to the Journey to Membership class some years ago, I recall one of the class participants approaching me at the break asking, how could any Unitarians ever be in favor of slavery? It was disturbing and astonishing to learn that some of our members from the distant past could condone such horrors. We have roots in toxic soil. Only 8 months before Reverend Staples' fiery abolitionist sermon, an act to incorporate the First Unitarian Society Milwaukee under the laws of the state of Wisconsin was approved on March 17, 1859. The incorporators were William H. Metcalf, the wealthy shoe manufacturer mentioned earlier, Edward P. Alice, manufacturer and predecessor to the Alice-Chalmers Company, and Charles F. Isley, banker. So the second incarnation of First Church happened in the crucible of the slavery and abolition debate, a turning point for our nation and our congregation. The revival of First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee in the mid-1850s was made possible by the wealth and power of merchants, manufacturers, bankers, and civic leaders committed to Unitarian beliefs. Their moral conscience and liberal faith, and the 28 families of our membership at that time, were called by their minister to grapple with our country's roots in and practice of chattel slavery. It's in our DNA as a congregation to be called to transform the toxic soil we inherit into something healthy and liberating. Molly Bochman wrote in 2016, after the Hiroshima, Fukushima, and Chernobyl nuclear disasters, fields of sunflowers were planted across the affected landscapes to help absorb toxic metals and radiation from the soil. Sunflowers are what environmental scientists call hyperaccumulators, plants that have the ability to take up high concentrations of toxic materials in their tissues. Like all land-based plants, flowers have root systems that evolved as extremely efficient mechanisms for pulling nutrients, water, and minerals out of the ground, among them zinc, copper, and other radioactive elements that are then stored in their stems and leaves. One of the early successes in sunflower research came almost a decade ago when a phytoremediation company called Eden Space Systems completed a successful cleanup of a lead-laced plot of land in Detroit. Much like the intestinal tract of a grown adult human is several feet longer than most of us can comfortably imagine, it's about 25 feet long, the New York Times reports that the maze of roots and root hairs of a single sunflower plant could total many miles. Perennial sunflowers have historically not been as popular as the domesticated sunflower because of their tendency to become invasive. In the case of a nuclear cleanup, however, the flower's capacity to spread rapidly is an asset. With a little assist from nature, an entire field can be neutralized, or at least significantly remediated within 3 years of planting. When we think about being a people of rootedness, we must admit that the ground in which our roots grow is troubled. Settler colonialism stripped away indigenous people's roots, their land, families, children, health, and connection to spirit in place. African people were brought here by force, their connections to their home and roots cut off. The ground is troubled because of what someone else has done in the past. We inherit the harm. Our roots are planted in toxic soil. We also inherit the responsibility to heal. What will we do to remediate the soil? Can we be phytoremediators like sunflowers, which draw out the toxins and make the soil healthy again? Unitarian Universalism is trying to examine our roots, detoxify the soil in which we find ourselves planted, and nurture a more inclusive culture of equity, justice, and joy. We get there by asking why things are as they are. How did things get this way? And listening to the stories we find. Following the maze of roots of our personal family stories, our congregational story, and our nation's story, and how they intertwine, is one way to create the spaciousness of choice. Black Lives Matter to Wisconsin UUs is working with Black community partners on reparations. Unitarian Universalists went to the headwaters of the Mississippi River last week to stand with Ojibwa people protesting Enbridge Line 3. We have the choice to send our roots in the direction of liberation and love. It's not easy, but love never promised easy.